The Gamecocks produced their best rushing performance on the season this past weekend against the Florida Gators. So now the question is, can they do it again against the Missouri Tigers?
You are Locked On Gamecocks, your daily podcast on the South Carolina Gamecocks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, Gamecock Nation, and welcome back to the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, your show for daily headlines and potential storylines on South Carolina's athletic teams. I'm Andrew Lyon, the host of this podcast, and also a staff writer for Gamecocks Digest over on SI.com. Thank y'all for making the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your first listen or watch for your team every day. We are free and available both on YouTube and wherever you get your audio podcasts daily. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/lockedoncollege and use code LOCKEDONCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Daily fantasy sports made easy. For today's show, we're going to talk about South Carolina's offense and how they're going to match up against the Missouri Tigers defense. But instead of breaking down every individual aspect of this matchup, I want to focus specifically on South Carolina's ground game, because this past Saturday, if there was any bright spot in this football game, it was the balance that we saw the Gamecocks offense have against a decent Florida Gators defense. For the first time all year, the Gamecocks rushing attack, in a way, really helped to kind of match what the Gamecocks were doing in the passing game. We saw it open up sort of the play action passing game a lot more. And the Gators had to legitimately respect South Carolina's ground game. We have not seen that a whole lot up to this point in the season. But after having a bye week to make some adjustments, Dowell Loggains and this staff, they seem to have unlocked something with this rushing attack. So now the question is, can the Gamecocks replicate some of that success against the Missouri Tigers defense this coming Saturday? And I think the answer to that question is yes, because the Missouri Tigers defense, they do have a couple of solid players up front, specifically number 15, Johnny Walker Jr. He is a guy that you're going to have to watch in this football game. But compared to the Florida Gators, I would say that this Missouri Tigers defense, they're kind of similar to the Tennessee Volunteers, except for they're a little bit smaller and they have a little bit less length in terms of their overall frames. Essentially, the Tigers rely on team speed in order to make plays happen, whereas the Gators this past weekend, they were a bit bigger and lankier in terms of the personnel that they had out there on the football field, but their team speed maybe wasn't quite as high. So running at the tackles in the zone run game was a good thing for South Carolina, and it helped to exploit that a little bit, especially along that defensive line. But Missouri, as I just mentioned, they're a bit smaller. They rely more on sort of speed and overall explosiveness to try and make plays happen in one-on-one matchups. So for this weekend's game, I think that Dowell Loggains and this offense would be better suited to try and utilize a bit more inside zone runs against this Missouri Tigers defense, where, you know, guys are going to be able to go one-on-one immediately in some of their blocking matchups. But at the same time, it's also going to open the door for some double teams where, you know, you might basically have some chip blocks happen spontaneously, and then one of those linemen's going to sort of work off of that chip block and go up to the second level and try to get to a linebacker. I think that this is the kind of game where you can find some success running that against the Missouri's defense, because what I noticed when watching the Tigers defense when they played the Kentucky Wildcats and also the LSU Tigers is that their interior defensive linemen especially had a tough time sort of holding their ground when they had to deal with multiple offensive linemen blocking them at one time. And I think that for South Carolina, this team blocking that you see on inside zone runs is what you're going to have to utilize if you want to once again have success in terms of your ground game. And I think that this is a game where South Carolina can do that. And I think it's also imperative to establish that because, as I'll talk about later on, you might be missing a key starter for your offensive line in Vershon Lee. So the answer to the question, can South Carolina can they replicate their rushing success this past week and do it once again this weekend? I think the answer is yes, but I think that they're going to have to approach things a little bit differently if they do want to replicate what all they did last Saturday against the Florida Gators. Now, when we come back in just a couple of moments, I'm going to discuss what kind of surprised me about this Missouri Tigers defense when watching back a couple of their games. A key difference between their defense this year and what they were doing in 2022. We'll touch on that in just a couple moments right here on Locked On Gamecocks. Today's show is brought to you by LinkedIn Jobs. Now, as a small business owner, you never want to be in a situation where you have maybe the wrong people in your small business doing some of the jobs that you need them to do. So you don't want to have maybe an interior designer that has no creative taste. Another good example is you don't want someone who is unorganized to be an event planner in your small business. And if you're struggling to find the right people in your small business, you need to check out LinkedIn Jobs because LinkedIn Jobs makes it easy to find those people. Just add your job and the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to let everyone know that you are hiring, and utilize tools like screening questions to filter through the candidates. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires, because LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. Again, that's linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free today. Terms and conditions do apply. Welcome back to this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your team every single day. And as always, a big thank you to each and every one of you everydayers who make the Locked On Gamecocks podcast your daily choice for South Carolina Gamecock sports coverage. All right, let's talk about Missouri's defense specifically now, because I just brought it up a moment or two ago. This is a defense that relies a good bit on their team speed, and this is something that worked quite well for them in 2022. If you recall South Carolina's 2022 game against the Missouri Tigers, which I get it, you probably had that blocked out of your memory by this point. You hate me for bringing it up, but in that game against Missouri, the Tigers were very aggressive with how much they blitzed Spencer Rattler, bringing different looks, having some disguised blitzes, sometimes bringing as many as 6 or 7 guys in the box and going after the quarterback. And when watching Missouri's games against Kentucky and LSU, I kind of expected to be the same thing because, hey, if it ain't broke, then don't try to fix it or make any sort of tweaks to it. But Missouri's defense is not playing that way this year. Now, that does not mean that the Tigers will not get aggressive. They will get aggressive, especially on first downs, to try to put you behind the sticks early on in drives. They will still run some unique blitz looks out of a 3-2-6 formation at times. But this Tigers defense, they do not sort of live and die by their sheer aggressiveness like they did last year. Depending on the flow of the game, even, they will use a lot more zone coverage, especially if they're having some trouble maybe stopping the opposing team's ground game. So why is this the case? Well, obviously, we can't put ourselves in the minds of Missouri fans and Missouri's coaching staff. I'll try to do my best regarding that when I talk to Locked On Mizzou host John Miller for a crossover show on Thursday. So be sure to tune in for that. But what I would guess is Missouri seems like they have a lot more trust in their individual players to make plays in one-on-one situations, both in terms of their defensive line and also especially in regards to their secondary. The other thing that I thought of is maybe Missouri's trying to avoid some boomer bust situations from taking place. So in essence, if a blitz ends up working, that's great. You just sack the quarterback for maybe like a 6+ yard loss. But let's say maybe it doesn't work, especially in the SEC against some of these really talented quarterbacks. It might end up leading to maybe a 50-plus yard touchdown catch or run for the opponent. And for Eli Drinkwitz, a man that is offensive minded, he is a guy that is mainly an offensive coach. I could see how he would maybe not want his defense to end up making play calls like that could allow for big explosive plays and also therefore touchdowns to be scored at a much higher rate, and thus putting more pressure on his offense to have to go out there and execute at a very high level. You usually hear that when it comes to defensive minded coaches, and that's typically where that stereotype lies at. But sometimes that is also the case, maybe for an offensive minded coach. And I do think that that could possibly be the case for Eli Drinkwitz and the Missouri Tigers when it comes to their defensive philosophy. So, overall, I'm not going to sit here and say that that means that South Carolina is going to have themselves a heyday against this defensive unit, because trust me, the Gamecocks, they still have to sort of shore up a couple of minor issues on their end as well. But it does seem like that Spencer Rattler, he is not going to be, necessarily having to worry about 6, 7 blitzers at times coming after him, at least as frequently as they did back in 2022. But this game is going to be a lot more difficult than it would have been, say, a week or two ago, because South Carolina, there may be a chance that they have to go out there without another one of their starters along the offensive line. In just a couple moments, we'll talk about an injury update that Shane Beamer gave about Vershon Lee on Tuesday afternoon. Before we touch on that, I do want to also let y'all know that today's show is brought to you by Prize Picks, the #1 daily fantasy sports app out there, because Prize Picks is the easiest and simplest fantasy sports app to use. Again, all you got to do is pick anywhere from 2 to 6 athletes and say they're going to do more or less than their projected stats in their upcoming match. So from the Monday show, I decided to go into the Monday Night Football game, and I said that Dak Prescott was going to throw for more than 257.5 passing yards against the Chargers. I said that Justin Herbert on the other side would throw for less than 279.5 passing yards against the Cowboys defense. And guess what? I was correct on both of those accounts. Dak threw for 272 yards and Justin threw for just 227 yards. So if you want to get in on the action at Prize Picks, go to prizepicks.com/lockedoncollege and use code LOCKEDONCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Again, that's prizepicks.com/lockedoncollege and promo code LOCKEDONCollege for a first deposit match up to $100. Daily fantasy sports made easy. All right, welcome back to this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast, where we cover your South Carolina Gamecocks every single day in just 30 minutes. Let's talk about the significance of Vershon Lee's injury, because this would be a very big blow to South Carolina's offensive line if Vershon Lee is unable to go on Saturday against the Missouri Tigers. And per Shane Beamer, it seems like that there's a pretty good chance that this could happen, because Vershon Lee is currently listed as doubtful for the Gamecocks Week 8 matchup against the Tigers in the other Columbia. So what exactly would this mean for South Carolina if Vershon Lee is unable to go? Well, this would impact the Gamecocks offensive line in multiple different facets. One, Vershon Lee is one of your leaders of this unit. I would usually say that there's 2 leaders on the offensive line, and this year that is the case with Vershon Lee and Nick Gargiulo, both being the most experienced guys, both having played the most football really out of anybody in this group, maybe besides Ja'Kai Moore, who right now is kind of a backup along the interior for the Gamecocks. But if Vershon Lee is unable to go, obviously that hurts you in terms of the leadership up front. But the other reason why this hurts you is because as of last week, Vershon Lee is now your starting right tackle. After all the changes that Dowell Loggains and the staff made to the O-line in lieu of the Florida game, those changes worked out pretty doggone well. But as we all can recall from that game in the second half, Vershon Lee was unable to play because apparently he got rolled up pretty badly late in the first half against the Gators. And I believe it was Sidney Fugard that went out there in his stead for the rest of that football game. And again, I'm not trying to pick on Sidney Fugard because he's certainly not the only one that's had pass protection issues this year, but there was definitely a bit of a drop off in terms of, the protection on that side of the offensive line once Vershon Lee was out of the football game. So the question is sort of, what do? You have played several guys at that spot this season, and quite frankly, outside of Vershon Lee and what he did this past week against Florida, you haven't seen a whole lot of good play at that spot. Sidney Fugard has gotten multiple chances, and quite honestly, he's struggled mightily at that position. Tyshawn Wanamaker has also gotten a couple chances. He has also struggled mightily. Those guys have not been consistent enough in order to hold down that spot, which is why Vershon Lee got moved there in the first place. And now there's a high probability that he won't be able to play. So this coaching staff, they're going to have a decision to make. They're going to have to either start Sidney Fugard and probably have to put a tight end over there and chip a lot on that side this week, hoping that the other side in Tree Babalade, he's going to hold up okay, or they're going to have to put Tyshawn Wanamaker there. I'm not going to say which guy I think they should play. I'm not going to whittle it down that much when it comes to this conversation, but I will go ahead and say this. I know that some fans are probably going to sit there and say, well, Andrew, if both of those guys have not played well up to this point in the season, why don't the coaches go ahead and just grab one of the other guys that they have and throw them out there? Like maybe a Jatavius Shivers, who is at that right tackle spot, is a true freshman, a part of a decent true freshman class, and hasn't really played much this year outside the Furman game. I can understand the frustration the fan base might have thinking that these coaches are just almost like not wanting to play some of these guys that they've got on this roster. But when it comes to the offensive line position group, that is a very finicky position. We've discussed this before when Tree Babalade and Trevon Ball looked like they might be getting some increased snaps in this unit. It is not that easy to start along the offensive line as a true freshman in college football, especially when you take into account that you're going up against SEC athletes and SEC defensive coaching staffs. It is not that easy to pull off. And Jatavius Shivers, from what I can recall, is a guy that is very raw. He is a bit of a project at this offensive tackle spot. He's a guy that when he played high school football the last couple years, he was mainly a run-blocking right tackle. Now, admittedly, that is usually the case for right tackles. Their strengths sort of lie in the run-blocking aspect of their game. But the issue is that everything that I can recall from watching his high school film, it all revolved around run blocking, which means either one, his football team did not throw the football a whole lot, which obviously is not the case in major college football, or B, maybe his pass blocking needs a little bit of work, and he didn't want to showcase that when it came to those highlight reels, or his coaches didn't want to showcase that. So my overall point here is that it's easy to just sit there and say that you need to just throw somebody else out there that might give them a shot. But you've also got to take into account Kason Henry right now is banged up. Now, the good news is he apparently did some things in practice today. Don't know if it's the first time he's done that in a while, but Shane Beamer seemed optimistic during his Tuesday presser that Kason Henry could be back very soon. So that is a good thing for the Gamecocks because they need him to come back in the worst way. But Jatavius Shivers, true freshman, probably not a good idea to throw him out there. And you've also got 6 or 7 other offensive linemen that are currently hurt right now. So I just don't know what you do here if Vershon Lee can't go. Maybe you put Ja'Kai Moore out there. I've already, I think, thrown that suggestion out several times, but for whatever reason, the staff, I think, just likes him on the interior a lot more this season, and they don't want to put him out there at right tackle. I think that that might be your best option if Vershon Lee can't go. And again, it sounds like he's not going to be able to. So point being, if Lee can't play against the Missouri Tigers, that certainly hurts the Gamecocks' chances of winning this football game. I get it. He doesn't play quarterback. He doesn't play running back. He's not like a number one wideout for you. But Vershon Lee is very important to this offense. And if you don't have him out there, then you're going to have to play with a even smaller margin for error on Saturday afternoon when you take on the Missouri Tigers. So we'll see if there's any positive updates regarding Vershon Lee's injury status as we go throughout the week. But with that being said, that's going to do it for this Tuesday edition of the Locked On Gamecocks podcast. I do hope you all thoroughly enjoyed today's show. As always, What are y'all's thoughts on how South Carolina's running game could potentially replicate the success they had last weekend, once again this weekend against the Missouri Tigers? If you've watched the Missouri Tigers play this year, do you think that there's some drastic changes that they've made to their defensive philosophy? And lastly, how much of a loss do you think it would be if Vershon Lee cannot go on Saturday? Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments section if you're watching this on YouTube, or shoot me a direct message on Twitter at @alion_SC if you listen to this show on an audio podcast app. But as always, thank y'all so much for tuning in. Have a great rest of your Tuesday, and I will be sure to catch y'all on the next show early on Wednesday right here on the Locked On Gamecocks podcast.